Greetings. I'm Jim Levinson, Director of the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs, and I'd like to welcome everybody with a special welcome to President Levin, who's joining us today. Today's event is part of a series, the Jackson Institute Conversations on Leadership, and the format today will be exactly that, a conversation. Leading that conversation, and here to introduce Secretary Paulson, is the man who has been spearheading the development of the leadership curriculum here at the Jackson Institute, former general and current senior fellow, Stan McChrystal.
Let me thank everybody for being here, and Hank, let me thank you and Wendy particularly for being here. What we're going to talk today is about leadership. There's going to be a financial component to it, and there's probably a lot more expertise on that than in the stands than there'll ever be in my seat up here. Well, because we're talking about leadership, I want to remind you what the Roman poet said, Virgil. He said, "Trust one who has been through it." Now, that's the only Roman poet quote I have. But it's always good to start with one. Hank, we're honored to have you today here, and I really appreciate it. Secretary of the Treasury, Hank Paulson, brings 4 decades of experience in public policy and economic background to us, and that culminated in his tenure as U.S. Treasury Secretary. He previously to that served as Chairman and Chief Executive of Goldman Sachs. Most importantly, he's a graduate of Dartmouth, where among other things, he was an All-East, All-Ivy, and an honorable mention All-American offensive lineman on the football team. He is a graduate of Harvard Business School, and he's currently a distinguished senior fellow at the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy Studies. He also has founded the Paulson Institute, an independent center located at the University of Chicago, dedicated to fostering international engagement to address issues of global importance. And as you know, he's a deep expert on China, and he's taken more than 80 trips there. So as we discuss activities today, one of the things that he and I discussed a little while ago is relationships and personal relationships and how they can impact policy. And of course, his insights on China in that regard will be huge. Hank, what I'd like to do is start out by just sort of hitting you up front. It says, a lot of times we're asked if leaders are born and made. And as Secretary of the Treasury, you faced one of the most challenging periods in our history, certainly financially. So as a leader, were you born or made?
Well, Stan, first of all, let me say it's terrific to be here with you all today, and it's an honor to be here with Stan. Now, in terms of leadership, you all may know what you want to be, but when I was graduating from Dartmouth College, when I went to Dartmouth College, I thought I wanted to be a forest ranger. I like the outdoors. I ended up as an investment banker. But I was always very suspicious of people who came out of their mother's womb knowing they wanted to be an investment banker. You know, I spent a few years in government before spending years in finance. But I really do believe the training that I had before I got to Treasury helped prepare me for the challenges I was going to go through at Treasury. But I happen to believe that life experience and training is very important in leadership.
Was there a single biggest experience in the way up that you remember?
No, Stan, there really wasn't. I'm probably not a good example of this because I know many people say, I want to be a CEO or I want to run this or that. What I did was I ended up in government right out of business school. I ended up working in the Pentagon for David Packard and an Assistant Secretary of Defense. I found I enjoyed financial issues, so I went to work for Goldman Sachs. And actually, I turned down promotions. I didn't go there. If you went to work for an investment bank, you didn't go there wanting to run it. You wanted to work with many companies and solve problems. And so I'm always a little bit suspicious of career engineers, people that want to map it out. I think that as a young person, you can afford almost anything other than not to learn and grow. And to learn, to grow, do things you enjoy, and that's really what I focused on. And then as my career progressed, I found I enjoyed management and leadership.
You've got a few Pentagon veterans in the room, as well as others who are probably aspiring. Can you compare the experience in the Pentagon with that which you got in your early years at Goldman Sachs?
Well, why don't I do it more for government, okay, just generally, because government is managing, leading in business is in many ways very different than in government. And I think the Pentagon and military is something else which we can get to. But just overall, I think it takes the same skill sets, but it takes a different mindset, because it's much more difficult in government, much more difficult, because you just take the position as Treasury Secretary. As Treasury Secretary, the only authority you have is essentially what the president gives you. So you have a boss, and so the key is your relationship with the president. And then a lot of your success is going to be your ability to persuade others, whether it's regulators or members of Congress or others, to do things that you want to get done. So it's not leading by fiat. I'm not saying you don't do that, and the best people don't do that in business either. But it is still much more difficult in government, because it's, as I explain to people all the time, you can have the best idea, but unless you can persuade others to adopt it, it's basically a worthless idea. So being able to persuade others, being able to find common ground. In government, there's very little low-hanging fruit. Things are either analytically difficult, like if you want to get health care reform done, it's analytically difficult, or Social Security reform is analytically simple but politically difficult. So everything it's important in government is difficult to get done, much more difficult to get done. Now, I think the Pentagon and getting into the military, it's another set of issues.
What kind of issues?
Well, again, I was there as a civilian. And so I was there as a civilian. I didn't wear a uniform, but it was, again, and I dealt with also with political issues, because people are going to think that all I know how to do is bailouts. But my first assignment was the Lockheed bailout. You remember? So I worked, which was very. So I worked with. And frankly, I didn't support that one, because I didn't think not that anybody cared what my position was. I was very junior, but there it was, again, working with Congress. It was a political process. But my experience, which was I was telling you earlier from the military, is I think what I was pleasantly surprised at, how expert all the people I worked in at the Pentagon were in terms of the training. I think the military does the best job of training people. And so that was one of my enduring impressions. And the other was the amount of waste and inefficiency that we have, and which was just extraordinary, and how much some of the decisions were made were political. Again, responding to masters in Congress, and so in any event, but that's not what we came here to talk about today.
Were there any people that you saw in government service when you were younger that you thought epitomized the most effective leadership in that environment?
Well, it's very interesting, because I get asked all the time, Stan, to take shots at people in government. And there's a lot I don't like about the process. But for the most part, people I saw worked very, very hard, whether they're in Congress or in the executive branch. No one goes there trying to do a bad job. Everybody's doing their best. The political jobs are particularly difficult, those that need to get elected. But the people, I very much admired David Packard, who was a founder of Hewlett Packard and was a Deputy Secretary of Defense. And I thought he was really a outstanding man. But yet he wasn't terribly effective at dealing with the bureaucracy, because I don't think ever made the adjustment as well as he needed to, that he wasn't at a company. And he could be overseeing the F-14 program, which was a fighter jet program, and he could say to the admiral who was running it, I want to know if there's going to be any, or to the captain at the time, if there's any overrun, I want to know about it. And surprise, surprise, the guy would make admiral, and then 2 weeks later it would come out there was an overrun, and he knew he wasn't working for David Packard. He was working for the head of Nav Air or something. So it is. I think that there are some people that were able, I think, to be very, very good at the substance and at the politics. I admired Melvin Laird, frankly, who I thought was an excellent excellent Secretary of Defense, and I had the opportunity to work with George Shultz when he was Treasury Secretary, and he was at Treasury when I was at the White House.
How was it different when you transitioned to the private sector? What did you carry from government that worked? What didn't work? How did you grow?
Well, in terms of I thought government was a great experience for the private sector. Just a great experience, because you learn how to multitask. You learn that you're not going to be successful unless you can communicate either in writing or verbally. You learn a lot about working with others. And I thought that I had, and I didn't realize it at the time, but I had the opportunity to go from the Pentagon to the White House to work with the cabinet secretaries and the president before I was 27 years old. And so then when that gives you, it increases your sense of confidence. And as I said, the skill set is very similar to what it takes in the private sector. It's just a different mindset.
In the private sector, you continued your evolution as a leader before 2006 you became Treasury Secretary. Was there anything in that private sector period that you thought particularly suited you besides sort of financial experience for cabinet?
Well, for me, it was, again, I've watched business leaders go to government, and some be successful and some not be successful. And the ones that aren't successful are the ones that either don't understand that they're no longer the boss, or even if they understand it intellectually, they can't emotionally get to that place. And I think the fact that in my career, I not only understood finance, but I had done so much work with clients. I had advised heads of state, I'd worked with many, many CEOs. And so I realized, emotionally and intellectually understood what it was to, even when I was a CEO, to work for someone else, to work for the principal, to advise them, to persuade them. So I came out of an environment where there was a premium placed on working with others, selling others. There was, and I think that helped me a lot. And then everyone's different. And I'm decisive by nature. And I think that particular skill set was a good one to have when I happened to be in Washington. I'd say the other thing that I learned, I learned from not only doing things, but from watching others. And so I got to work with many, many CEOs around the world. And one of the things that became very obvious to me in watching them was that there is no leader anywhere, no head of state, no CEO. You pick the best ones, they all have weaknesses. Every one. They're all people, they all have weaknesses. And the weaknesses are usually the flip side of a positive. Hank is candid. Hank is indiscreet. Hank is decisive. Hank isn't thoughtful enough or whatever. And so as you move up and take on more and more senior positions, the world's very unforgiving. And it always will find out and uncover the weaknesses. So the good ones are self-aware and they surround themselves with people that have complementary skill sets, people that can cover up for their weaknesses. And so that, I think, helped me more than anything when I became a CEO of Goldman Sachs. And in terms of, and helped me work in Washington. And so I think that's one of the things I learned. And then I went through a number of crises, financial crises, when I was at Goldman Sachs.
What was the biggest challenge at Goldman Sachs? What was the one that you think of as the moment?
Well, I would say the biggest one was what was in 1998 when we had postponed our public offering because we had losses. There was the financial crisis. You remember Russia defaulted. There was Asian financial crisis. It was a liquidity crisis, and so that was. And I'd say we went through it in '94, just when I came up to become the chief operating officer and of the firm. And I'll say this about crises: when people say to me, "Well, you know, what is it like going through something that was as impactful as, you know, the financial crisis in 2007 and 8?" You know, when you're going through a crisis, even one that's a lot smaller than that, it feels very much the same. I mean, a crisis is a crisis. And you're not saying, well, you know, if I'm boiling in oil, it doesn't make much difference if it's right 180 degrees or 200 degrees. It's you're still boiling in oil. So I boiled in oil before.
As some of these guys can tell you, every firefight feels like Gettysburg, depending upon where you are.
Yeah.
Let's move to your assumption of the job as Treasury Secretary. When you walked into the job, how did you think the landscape of government? It was the last quarter of an administration, last 2 years. How did you sense that the environment was? Well,
Stan, I had not. See, I joined 2.5 years in the middle of 2006 with 2.5 years to go.
Right.
And I had turned the job down twice,
right,
which tells you what, I mean, I had a mother who, you know, was just terribly distressed. I mean, cried, you know, when I accepted. She said, "You started off working for Richard Nixon and now George Bush. You should be ashamed of yourself." You know, I had a wife who you know, and as a matter of fact, matter of fact, as I was walking out of a lunch for Hu Jintao at the White House in the spring of 2006, Wendy could see I was rather quiet, and she said, "I hope you didn't turn down this job because of me." And I said, oh no, I did it for other reasons. And she said, "Well, that's good, sweetie, because if it was very important to you, I would have agreed." And I took that when they came back the third time and accepted. But what my concern was really gets to your earlier question. I was worried about what I could do working with a president who was, you know, 28% in approval ratings at that time, the last 2.5 years. But I think, truth be told, when they came back the third time, I really was asking myself, will I be successful? You know, I knew I could be successful in the private sector. I knew enough about government to, you know, wonder whether I could be successful. And so I think that was and then as soon as I recognized that was holding me back, I said, boy, I don't want to give in to that fear. And, you know, fear of failure. And so and I really owe a great deal to my country, so I accept it. But then when I came on, I had underestimated the opportunity, because even without the financial crisis, what I found was every day, if you define your job expansively, which is what I think good leaders need to do, there were things, we started up the strategic economic dialogue with China. We did all kinds of things that you can do in government. So my mindset when I went on was to run 100 miles an hour.
That's a great approach. As we came upon the crisis that turned into the financial crisis, how soon did you recognize it as a storm cloud coming, and how accurately do you feel you got it now in hindsight?
Well, it's interesting because I underestimated the extent of the problem every step of the way, right up until we got the TARP authority. But yet, when I showed up in Washington, I was expecting a problem. The president had asked me in the very first meeting at Camp David with the economic team to talk about entitlements reform, which is one of the reasons why I'd come. And I said, no, I don't want to talk about that. I'd like to talk about the financial crisis. I think we're overdue for one, and I see a lot of excesses. And so we talked about that, and I focused on over-the-counter derivatives. And he said to me, if the crisis comes, what will cause it? And I said, I don't know, sir, but I tell you one thing, when it does happen, it'll be obvious after the fact. I didn't see Russia, I didn't see Asia. And so right away I started getting the president's financial group, the other regulators, working closely with Ben Bernanke and Tim and others, Tim Geithner, who was at the New York Fed. Right away we started working, I started the relationships with working with members of Congress on reform of Fannie and Freddie. And so I think I was more concerned than most people there, almost anyone. But what I'd missed was that what I think most people missed was, because a bubble by definition, you don't know the extent of it until it bursts, was that we weren't just dealing with subprime. Housing prices, there'd been no time since World War II that you'd had a general decline in residential housing prices, because we had all these flawed policies to overstimulate housing prices. And so the risk you had if you got a residential mortgage was you'd get paid back too quickly. And so I had missed that, and really the extent of the overall credit bubble, because that was, and so, but I would say this, if I'd been omniscient, I couldn't have done a different thing. In other words, we got incredible authorities, and it took Fannie and Freddie, getting ready to go down to get the first set, and the House voted no to the TARP even the first time. But so I was onto this early on, but the extent of it, no.
Sort of philosophically, you described yourself as decisive, and in your book it's pretty clear, and in the other accounts it's pretty clear as well. There's always a tendency for leaders to also be cautious. Right. Some people say don't rush to make a mistake. What's the balance there, particularly when a situation is unclear?
Well, you need to, we could talk for a long time, which I've tried to use. You've probably learned brevity isn't my greatest asset, so I will try to be briefer here. But when you're managing in a crisis, you're going to be working with imperfect information, right? And if you wait till you get all the information you like, you'll be looking in the rearview mirror, it'll be too late. And when you're dealing with a big, messy, unprecedented problem, there's going to be no elegant, perfect solution. It's going to be, and so the crisis, the timing is you always have to trade off acting without sufficient information and without a perfect solution against the cost of inaction. And there was never a situation where I really was debating, geez, how much longer should I wait? I mean, this was what you have to be prepared to act, and then if the facts change or your understanding changes, you've got to be persuaded. You've got to be prepared to change. And so I did a number of things that I think were very objectionable, but they're easy to do because they were better than the alternative. And so that's sort of the way I thought about it.
As you start to act, there are always a group of people, be it pundits, media, or even people around you that are sort of whispering in your ear saying, you're going the wrong way, you're doing the wrong thing, hold off, go faster. How do you personally deal with that?
Well, it's interesting, Stan, because I think my situation was probably different than yours, where everybody was debating different strategies. And so to describe mine, there was this unprecedented situation, and I wasn't surrounded by people who said, I've got a better idea, okay? And so what I found was this, that if, and I had a great partner. I mean, Ben Bernanke and Tim Geithner, I had a huge advantage. I had a year before the crisis to build a relationship with George Bush of trust, and he was just a terrific boss, just terrific in terms of he was a quick study, understood, and he only cared about what was the right thing for the economy. He didn't worry about the political reaction or ideology or whatever. And so because I had a boss who kept bucking me up and kept saying, we're not going to worry about politics. We're going to save this economy, and because I had those really good partners, what I was dealing with was this: that first of all, if you had an idea, and no one had a better idea, the idea, even if it was an imperfect idea, won. And other people, if they didn't have a better idea, or if they were scared, they didn't fight you. So the issue that I dealt with was the politics. People that worked with me, it took courage, because when you did things that you knew going in was going to be very unpopular. It's, first of all, if you're a politician and you got to run for office, that's really hard. I mean, the first time I went up to the Hill and talked to Congress and said we needed the TARP authorities, and Ben and I explained that the financial arteries were frozen and what was going to happen to the economy in a number of months, but it was going to be an absolute collapse if we didn't get this authority. Barney Frank said to me, Hank, this is bad. You'll never prove a contrafactual. And this was late at night, and I said, Barney, what's a contrafactual? Well, he said, listen, if you go, you'll never get credit for preventing a catastrophe people didn't see. You're going to say we're in deep doo-doo, give us this authority, and you'll get it. And if it all works, people will say it didn't work. See, we still have a problem. So every member of Congress that voted for the TARP, unless they were stupid, and there weren't many of them that were stupid, knew that that was an unpopular vote. And so the kinds of resistance you got in Congress was no one worked against me in Congress. Some people stepped aside and stood up and made speeches, heads of certain committees, and made speeches, but if they'd worked against it, we wouldn't have got the authority. And others, some voted no, because, I guess because they sincerely didn't understand the problem. But I think most of the people that voted no just knew it was going to be a very unpopular vote. And in the administration, I had the support of the president and the executive branch, and I had a team. One of the conditions I had on coming down to Washington was that I would be able to replace all political appointees, regardless of party. We wouldn't, and I had a really good team, and people in the executive branch that cared about a lot about what the public thought about them, or were concerned that they'd be investigated or criticized, just sort of stepped aside or were ineffective. But it wasn't like people said, well, we should pursue a different strategy, or we shouldn't do nation building or whatever.
Right.
I mean, when you talk about saving a financial system, it's not like there were a lot of, with insufficient authorities, it wasn't like there was a lot of people standing there saying, I got another idea. and some people said, well, we just, some people in Congress said, well, if we just change the accounting and don't have mark-to-market accounting, the problem will go away. Well, that was just a talking point. I don't think they really believe that in their heart of hearts.
You talked about relationships a little while ago, and yet you had long-standing relationships with a lot of the players in this and some shorter term. Can you talk about where they were important, how you nurtured them, how you maintained them in the crisis?
Well, first of all, again, and I would say this to everyone in this room, and I just can't emphasize it enough, that leadership or being effective is finding common ground, working with other people, listening with other people. So I had a year to do this, and before the crisis. And so I had a real opportunity to I had a deal with George Bush when I joined. I would be the primary spokesman and advisor on all domestic and international economic issues. But I knew that if it didn't work, that paper wasn't worth anything, and that it would be my fault and not his. So I had to develop that relationship of trust. And then I had a team at Treasury where I selected them, and these were people that I knew had skills that complemented mine and knew how to get things done. And I then had the other understanding I had with the president, which he really welcomed, was that I wouldn't be partisan. I wouldn't get involved in any politics. I wouldn't get involved in the election. So I knew to get things done, the leadership of the Hill were Democrats. And so I had started working with Barney Frank very early on reform of Fannie and Freddie. And the Republicans had one view, and I actually agreed with the Republicans. But I didn't want to leave without getting anything done without compromising. So and Barney, to me, was a real hero. I mean, when we got the authorities we got, it was a working relationship with him. I had an opportunity to work with Nancy Pelosi on a trade deal and stimulus. I worked, we had Harry Reid over for a chicken dinner, and we got to know him, and I worked with him on a lot of things. And so that is, and just meeting someone doesn't do it. We had opportunities to work together. I worked so that was critical, because there's got to be a certain level of trust, or you just not going to get things done.
Can you jump that into your long-time relationship with some of the Chinese leaders?
Well, I don't think Chinese, frankly, I think this is pretty universal. We were just talking, coming in, Stan was asking me about how important relationships are in China, and they are important, but they're important everywhere. And it helps, again, if you've worked with people. Now in China, I had the great privilege of working with a number of the people that are important leaders now and former leaders on the most important early transactions, the first privatizations, China Mobile, Bank of China, PetroChina. I had an opportunity to work with Jiang Zemin on parks in Yunnan. I'm very interested in conservation. And I've always been interested in spending time on I always tell people that work-life balance is important. I've been interested in conservation. And so I chaired a conservation group in Asia. I worked with Zhu Ranji in putting together he was a former premier of China, on setting up an executive management program at Tsinghua. And that's how I got to know Hu Jintao, who's the current president. So again, life is and getting to know them, and a relationship isn't just shaking hands and having dinner and exchanging cards and so on. It's working to get things done.
We've got a room full of high achievers who've been very successful, and you had a life from Dartmouth on of tremendous string of successes. What was your biggest mistake or failure, and any regrets, and how do you deal with that?
Well, I would say this. It's an interesting thing that I can't point to any single big regret or failure, but I can tell you one thing which is fascinating. I have always had a philosophy which is define the job expansively and run to problems rather than run away. And so I've tended to be aggressive. And I had once, I don't know, 20 years ago at Goldman Sachs, I had one of my fellow partners say to me, for a joke, Hank is going to make a speech to everybody on the limits of aggressiveness. And it's going to be one word, none, and so I stood up, and I remember just simply saying there really are limits, because and talked a lot about integrity and actually always knowing you're doing the right thing and never being afraid if someone asks you to do something, because I was at the White House during Watergate, and it just was, I learned an incredible lesson when I watched. It's never really interesting why there's not a lot of bad people, why bad people do bad things. That's not interesting at all, right? And it's not interesting why good people do good things. But why good people do bad things is very interesting. And so I talked about groupthink and people making a mistake because their boss tells them to do something and they're afraid to ask a question. But then once you put that aside, which is very important, I said, as aggressive as I am, the mistakes I've made, all of them were errors of omission, not commission. In other words, we're trained to not push the envelope or to ask embarrassing questions or to try to persuade people to do something they don't want to do, even if you think it's right. And so I think that's right. And then I tend not to look back. I get asked a lot during the financial crisis, what mistakes. And so, want me to talk about that a little bit? Or,
sure, please.
So that would be, because it's an interesting thing. I made plenty of mistakes. And I will talk about a number of them in a minute. But I think the biggest things, as I look back now, I just say how fortunate I was, because I think with really inadequate authorities and a really flawed regulatory system, we dealt with an unprecedented situation, and I think the big decisions we made, we got right, and they prevented a far worse crisis. But I think a lot of the things that as I look back, a lot of the things we get criticized for were not mistakes. Like, for instance, Lehman Brothers going down. A lot of people, even though Ben Bernanke and Tim Geithner and I have all said we couldn't find an authority to save them, we wanted to save it. A lot of people questioned that. No one said, here's the authority you had that would have saved them. I mean, we couldn't put capital, we couldn't guarantee a Fed loan into a bank run. Doesn't work. So, and some of the mistakes I made or misjudgments were fortuitous. In other words, we're very lucky. I could never, twice I had to go to Congress and get really unprecedented authority. With Fannie or Freddie, I said I need unlimited. My staff said you can't get unlimited, so we asked for unspecified. I got unspecified. But if I'd gone and said we're going to nationalize Fannie or Freddie, we wouldn't have got it. And I didn't believe we needed to. I thought if I had the bazooka, I wouldn't have to use it. I didn't know how bad the problem was until we got inside. With TARP, I actually hoped and believed we could use illiquid assets purchases. And if I'd gone to Congress and said, we want to put capital in, Republicans never would have voted for it. And fortunately, I sincerely believed everything I said. I thought we were going to put illiquid assets in. We got some capital authority if we had to nationalize banks if they failed. And when it was clear the problem was so severe, we switched. So I was fortuitous. The mistakes were all ones of communication. It was just a whole series of things. I sent up at midnight a 3-page outline to Congress on TARP. That got perceived as being arrogant, take it or leave it. That was supposed to be a starting point for a discussion, it wasn't definitively what we needed or whatever. But I had a lot of other press conferences at midnight. I might as well have had a press conference there and explain that, but we didn't do it. I never did a good job of explaining setting expectations on bank lending and saying, there's no way the government can or should make banks lend. Lend more than what? Or how is government going to make them lend? Or letting people know it was going to take a while. And, I never, ever, of course, this last one, I used to say it was a mistake, and now I really wonder whether it was possible. I never, ever explained in a convincing way to the American people that the bank rescues were for the American people, not for the banks. And when I left office, 92% of the Americans were against the TARP. In the same poll, 60% were against torture.
Right.
And so stop and think about that for a minute. But on the one hand, on the other, I don't think it's all wrong that the American people don't like bailouts. And if we had all the tools we needed, we wouldn't have needed to have bailouts. But most leaders I know, and most ones I admire, have had major setbacks and then picked themselves up from that setback. And I wish I could tell that story, but I just never had any in my career.
Yeah, I'll regale you with some.
Yeah.
I'd like to open it just for any
Good.
last thoughts but I'd like to open it for questions in the audience. Anything you've got?
I've got no last thoughts. I think as many questions as we have here,
Absolutely.
the better.
Great. Sir?
Hi, my name is Jason Chooks. I'm a sophomore at Yale College.
Yeah.
My name is Jason Tubes. I'm a sophomore. In America, we often admire leaders who can make a decision and see it through to the very end. When do you think it's appropriate to stick to a decision, and when do you think it's appropriate to renegotiate or compromise on a position you've taken?
I think that's a really key question. And I would say that I think when if you know conclusively something is a mistake or the facts change, a good leader changes. And I have, all my life, I've prided myself on having a point of view, but listening and, not changing just because it's being criticized or because it's unpopular or you hear, some leaders, I've just known leaders that they get briefed one day, they make a decision, someone else comes in and gives them a briefing the next day, or persuades them, and they go, they change, and obviously you can't do that. But I will tell you, I made a couple of reversals, and I didn't debate about it a second. I remember going and seeing George Bush and telling him, we'd gone in, I'll just give you the story. We went to Congress. I didn't want to nationalize banks. The idea was to recapitalize banks by buying illiquid assets. The situation worsened to the point that we had banks going down all across Europe, that our financial system was teetering. We need to move quickly. The $700 billion in TARP, I mean, we needed to ultimately do something with $350 billion of bad assets at Citi. I mean, it wouldn't have gone very far. So when I went to the president and told him that we're going to change, and we designed a very, very unique program. Nothing had ever been done like this before, I think, in the world, which wasn't nationalizing banks, but just putting capital in a lot of banks. He basically said, wow, you know, that this is, you know, it could surprise a lot of people all around the world. But he quickly also said to me, you know, you've got to do what you got to do and do what it takes to save our economy. So I didn't, that was an easy decision for me, as politically uncomfortable as it was, because I thought we either were looking at that or the collapse of the system. You know, that was not like a hard decision to make, but I actually think you show me a leader that doesn't change their mind, and I think you're looking at a poor leader, because we've talked about crises today, but I'll go further. Even if it's not a crisis, if you're in a business situation or in a military situation or whatever, I would argue that if you'll never have all the information you want, or it's too late. And if information changes, the world changes, facts change, you better be prepared to change. Now, there's certain things, you know, maybe certain principles that are just inviolate, but those better be few and far between, like your integrity.
Anybody else? Sir.
So earlier in the talk, you mentioned that you really learned by watching other leaders. I was wondering, when you are looking at leaders, when you were looking at leaders, what are the key things that you try to see? You know, is it their decisions? Is it their relationships? Like, what do you look for when you're studying other leaders?
It was an interesting thing. As I said, everybody's got strengths and weaknesses. But I say there's certain things that most good leaders have in common. And in no particular order, I think they are intellectually curious. They just have an insatiable appetite to keep learning. And so I think that's true about most good leaders. I think that most good leaders care about people. And if they don't, you know, if they're not authentic, they get found out. It's amazing the mistakes you can make along the way and have your team try to, have your team want to help you if you care about them. So I used to have people that, you know, that worked for me that would want to be mentored, and I'd mentor them. I'd say, but wait a minute, you're not taking care of those that work for you. And you could see that. I could see the leaders that really cared about the organization and cared about the people. I think that was important. I think most good leaders do what I call, define the job expansively. And I'll point that out because I can see young people from the day I started working with them right up until people became CEOs. If you define your job expansively, you're not looking at any task narrowly. You're saying, how does it fit into the bigger picture? How is it relevant? They're helping create their jobs. I would say people that worked for me, I would tell them that they promote themselves before I'd promote them. So defining that, I tell you, the really good leaders don't sit there like they're a spectator at a ball game and say, how could those idiots do this? I mean, the good leaders are accountable and they run to problems. And rather than pointing the fingers elsewhere. The really good leaders don't personalize. You just don't do it. It's not about you, it's about the organization, it's about the mission. You don't make ad hominem attacks. If people criticize your decisions, you don't take it personally. And I really respect it. And they listen, so, and they've got people skills. But other than that, and they've got a a great sense of integrity. The very best leaders, they're not working for money. They've got a higher purpose. But you take that aside, and then they come in all shapes, sizes. You know, some are better salespeople, some are better analytically, but the good ones, as I said earlier, were self-aware. So I came away, if I had one thing I knew when I became head of a firm, was I better be self-aware, and I better put people around me, you know, real diversity. You know, and the other thing is, well, anyway, I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
I have a question concerning political leadership as opposed to your leadership in business, and that is the relationship between strategy and tactics.
Strategy and taxes?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absent the crisis, of course, for which you
Right.
cannot have ex ante a strategy. But when you came into your job, did you have a strategic vision as to where you wanted to go? The other leaders that you saw, did you feel that they had a vision as a strategy, a long-term strategy where they wanted to go, or did you see them as people who just want to stick around as long as possible and make tactical adjustments in order to arrive somewhere? How did you reconcile these two elements?
Well, you will get me going on this right now, because I believe we are the strongest, richest nation economically in the world, and we've got fewer problems than any other nation, but that we have a failed political process that's greatly flawed. And I think what you tend to see is people do, you know, for political leaders, the public is, you know, votes are their jobs, and they care about being reelected, they care about public opinion. So it's very difficult to get things done, to have a long-term view if you're running for office every 2 years, and if you care about being elected. And so just take taxes. I'll take two things. I'll take taxes and I'll take income inequality. But let me take taxes. Okay, we have a failed tax system. We shouldn't be debating what the rates should be on those that make more than $250,000. You know, progressivity and having the rich pay more is an easy thing to do. What we should be, we need more tax revenues. You know, tax revenues are like 15 to 16% of GDP today. They've averaged over 18% for the last 40 years, and they probably need to be more than that today. So the only question is, what form of taxes will give us the revenues we need and let us be competitive, create jobs and growth? And no one will say that the current system is the right one. And if you put political leaders in a room and members of Congress, both sides of the aisle, give them truth serum, they're meeting individually, they all know this, and they all know that we need an answer. So we need bipartisan compromise. The deficit, you know, I was saying to Stan earlier, the biggest threat to our national security is debt, okay? And we don't have a debt crisis, we have a government crisis. You know, people could solve that. You know, Bull Simpson gave us the answer to that. I mean, you could solve that if we spread the sacrifice around. And so my own view is we have structural issues that predated the Great Recession or the financial crisis. As a matter of fact, they helped cause it. You know, income have been stagnant for decades in this country, middle class incomes. And that's part of what caused people to borrow so much. And while we had household debt that's way above any kind of sustainable level. So the question for me, and I don't want to be a pessimist, because twice I got Congress to act and do things that were very unpopular. It took a crisis, but it didn't have to collapse first. But we're going to have to solve some of these problems. They're all solvable, but the public can't send people to office and say, give us benefits we don't want to pay for, which is what most Western democracies are doing today. And so it takes, but I believe if we had, I had a guy I sat next to the other day, he happened to be a very conservative Republican senator, and I probably won't quote him by name, but what he said was, we'd solve all the problems if we had one Congress, all the senators and all the members of the House saying, I'm here only for one term, I'm not going to run again. I'm going to do this for my nation. This is going to be the gift to the United States of America. I'm here for one term, now let's get together and solve all our problems. But so the key thing is, no, we don't take a long-term strategic view. To taxes, to health care, to Social Security, to immigration, to education, whatever.
Go in the center.
So we focus a lot on how to be a leader, but not enough on why. From all the leaders that you've come across, Mr. Paulson, what have you seen other than a higher mission has been a factor driving personally these leaders and what they do?
Well, I believe, I'm trying to think how I can say this. I think to say I want to lead is the wrong way to look at life. I think what all of us want to do is to make a difference, to be relevant. And so, and I think happiness and satisfaction comes from working hard to achieve something that's not easy, that is difficult to achieve, and makes a difference. And so when people would come to me at Goldman Sachs and say, Hank, I don't know, should I go to Asia? Should I go to Europe? Should I be a trader? Should I be an investment banker? I'd say, you're asking me? I mean, what is it you really are interested in, care about? And so I think with most people today, it starts with what do you care about? What is your, people overuse the word passion, but what do you really, what really interests you? And then I think, I tell people all the time, there is no perfect job. There is no such thing. There's nothing perfect in the world. But there's a right one for you. And the important thing is to do something where you're going to learn and grow and get skills, which will then let you make a difference in things you want to do. And there's different forms of leadership. People, trust me, I know all kinds of, I've worked with all sorts of people that made it to the very top, and I know all sorts of, I don't know a single CEO or person that made it to the top of any organization that says, well, I made it to the top, but I screwed up my family life, I don't have any friends, but I'm happy, And I know, and I know many people that didn't get exactly where they wanted to get professionally, but they've got a good work-life balance. They're doing things they're interested in, and they're doing things they do well. The other thing is, which I think young people make, I've just watched young people make the mistake of saying, this sounds good, I'm going to do it because it's a hard job to get, everybody wants to get it, or as opposed to saying, I want to pick something I'm going to enjoy and do well. So I think leaders, I can tell qualities. I can look at young people and say they've got qualities that are going to let them be outstanding leaders. But that may mean that they're being a great teacher or a principal, or that they're going to be great in science or the military or whatever. They're what I call difference makers. People that have got ideas and people that can persuade others. But they're different leadership styles, and some people don't want to, and it's not right for them. They can be important leaders and not be the top person in an organization. I don't know, does that help?
Thank you.
Go ahead.
You mentioned earlier that your sort of biggest regret was not being able to properly communicate to the American people that the bailouts were for them and not for the banks. And I think, from my perspective, it seems like a lot of the anger is because Wall Street recovered long before Main Street.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could comment on whether you thought leaders on Wall Street acted irresponsibly in giving themselves bonuses, sort of, which they couldn't have done without taxpayer money.
Yeah, I would say that I think that's right. First of all, the answer is yes. There was anger at the bonuses and compensation levels on Wall Street, no doubt about it. I also believe that there's the way the situation worked. First of all, to just step back a bit, people on Wall Street made all kinds of mistakes, huge mistakes. But in every financial crisis, what has generally happened, go back from the history of time, the crises take place, the root cause isn't the banks. It never is. It's flawed government policies. What are the policies that cause us to overstimulate housing? Fannie or Freddie, interest rate deduction on any mortgage, $1 million or whatever, FHA programs, state programs. What are the policies that cause us to tax policies that borrow and too much and not save, et cetera? I could go through any, but what happens is there's then, people always blame the banks. And that's fine blaming the banks because there's things that they got to change, but if you don't fix the ultimate problem, you're going to be back there again. Then secondly, what happens is the way it always happens in terms of the economy, the problem will show up first at the banks. And the reason you need to do something for the banks is if they collapse, boy, it's then you're going to the economic dark ages. You know, there was a time when we had $3.8 trillion in money market funds, and they were getting ready to implode. And you know, they were funding commercial paper that corporations were used to borrowing. And we came so close to we had AAA industrial companies that couldn't sell commercial paper. So if we'd had a situation where if they'd gone down, not only would we the 30 million Americans that had their money in money market funds and thought they were money good, but all the companies wouldn't be able to make their payments on accounts payable or lay off workers. It would just be a vicious cycle. But the problem starts at the banks, and then if it works the way it should, the banks should recover first. So the banks recovered first, but there was insensitivity because, but I think even without the bonuses, the thing that I had totally underestimated, and most members of the press told me they underestimated, most members of Congress said they underestimated, was when we put the money in the banks, we weren't nationalizing them. We put it not just in failing banks, we asked the banks to take it because rather than dealing with serial one-off failures and nationalizing them, we wanted to recapitalize. So we put in preferreds on very attractive terms, knowing that the money would come back. And I actually thought we'd put that money in and that we'd have 3,000 banks take it. They'd hold it for 3 to 5 years. It'd be better than any stimulus plan, et cetera. But the press immediately started writing about nationalization, and the public hated it. The FDIC guarantee, which was a bigger benefit, the public didn't understand. And so then it got stigmatized, and the program worked because the money came back with a profit, and the banks paid it back pretty quickly, and many of them didn't. Only 700 took it. But my point is, the American people, even if their bonus was a huge hot point, but the bank's not lending, even though people did more than more than they would have should have lent if they collapsed, more than they lent at the height of the bubble. But I would say that no matter what had happened, the American people would have blamed the banks, and the program would have been stigmatized. And that's not all bad, because we shouldn't. In the United States of America, if you take a risk and you make a profit, people understand it. If you take a risk and the taxpayer pays for it, they don't understand it. And what we really needed was authorities so that we could wind down failing institutions. and they wouldn't be propped up in their current form. But that's, I think,
We've probably got time for one or two more questions max, so let's go up here. Sir. Okay, pass.
I'm from Beijing, China. So as the Victor Liang from your law school, so I ask questions regarding China because it's the Global Affairs Institute event. So 2 weeks ago, like the Vice President, Mr. Xi Jinping visited the Washington D.C. in the first night. Mr. Xi have the dinner with a lot of old friends. As you are joining together. So I'm just wondering, could you kind to evaluate the historic trip about Mr. Xi, and is any difference to current President Hu and other, before the generation Chinese leaders? Because it's true, Xi most likely should be our leader in the next 10 years.
right.
And also, I wonder, currently, Senator McCain and Republic candidate from president candidate, Romney, have a lot of criticized China on the Wall Street Journal.
Good.
I just wonder, what's your comments about the American leadership in Asia and China, the rise in tomorrow and the U.S.-China relationship? Thank you so much.
Right. Well, I'll try to be brief here. You're right. I did have dinner with Xi Jinping when he arrived. I've known him for a while. Actually, my first trip to China as Treasury Secretary, I stopped in Hangzhou and saw him before I went on to Beijing and saw the other leaders in 2006. I think he's going to be a strong leader. He is quite self-confident. He was in the dinner very unscripted, spontaneous, and he's going to need to be a strong leader, because when you look at the volatility in the world and you look at the challenges he will face over the next 10 years, because the expectations of the Chinese public continues to rise. As you know, they've got great expectations. And given the size and complexity of that economy and the massive change that needs to be managed on a scale that's never been managed before, he has his work cut out for him. And I think it's really to China's benefit and our benefit that you've got that kind of leadership, because the problems that we have in this country are of our own making, and they're all going to be more difficult to solve if China has a problem than if China doesn't. So we've got our differences, but I think that almost every problem in the world becomes easier to solve if the two countries can work together. Now, in terms of the U.S. leaders being critical, this is a political season, right? And in China, it's a political season too. There's going to be a government change, and nationalism and protectionism plays a little bit in both countries. There's no doubt that you can't go wrong as a politician in the U.S. criticizing China and blaming China when you're running for election. But the thing that I take some comfort in is the leaders of both parties have, what they've done is they've criticized China and said, gee, we want China to play by the rules. They're criticizing trade practices. And there we've got, dispute resolution authorities. You don't need a trade war. Got the WTO, you go to the WTO. So I think it's a little bit different this time than other elections, because right now we've got economic challenges and anxiety in this country, and there's plenty of, as well as China's doing, there's plenty of challenges in China. And particularly given the uncertainty here, what I'd like to see is a vision from leadership that is where it's self-confidence based upon acknowledging some of the challenges we've got and recognizing the best way we're going to solve them is to be open to the rest of the world. And I don't think leaders here have crossed the line, but I don't think you should also be overly concerned, because this is a political season. And it's a little bit what I saw. You know, when I wrote my book in the crisis, it was a collision of markets and politics, right? What made the crisis so difficult for me to deal with was 6 weeks before an election. So I was talking to Barack Obama and John McCain, you know, every couple of days, talking with leaders, because if any of the leaders had come out against the TARP, we wouldn't have got, you know, what we needed. And here, I think this is just a trickier time to manage this relationship. But I think for all of us who want there to be a strong relationship between the U.S. and China, we can be very grateful that Xi Jinping had a terrific trip here. I think the American people got to see him, you know, in Iowa and in Los Angeles, and I think it was a positive rather than a divisive trip, and I think that's a good sign. It's a testament to him, and it's a testament to the leaders we have in the United States that outside of the election, they still, I think, treated him with great courtesy and respect, showing the importance of the relations between our two countries.
Great. Let's go one more in the back, all the way.
Secretary Paulson, thanks, first of all, for coming. We really appreciate it. And thanks to everyone from Jackson for organizing this event. I think we all really have enjoyed it. Secretary Paulson, one of the first things you mentioned was the importance of being an effective leader, of getting real-world experience. Do you feel that as you move up to very high levels of leadership, that there's maybe a danger that you might lose some of that real-world perspective that you had, that you might otherwise have? Do you think it's a valid concern? And if so, what do you do to prevent that and prevent becoming out of touch?
Well, that's something I worked on all the time. When I ran Goldman Sachs, I think I had a different approach than just about any leader, and you could be criticized for it. But I spent a reasonable amount of my time, probably a third of my time, working with clients. And that wasn't just calling them and being the statesman-like role. It was taking active roles, advising clients. I thought that kept me close to the markets, kept me close to what, you know, losing business, winning business, let me know what the competition was doing, and I enjoyed it. And when I was at Treasury, it was very interesting. I was terribly fortunate to have a partner like Ben Bernanke, who is just a tremendous economist and had studied economic history and so knew what had happened in the Great Depression inside and out. And then what I did was, rather than just looking at Bloomberg machines and quotes, you know, and so on, I did something I got criticized for afterwards, but I got to tell you, I'd do it again every day of the week at the middle of a crisis. I all the time talked with people. I didn't care if they were, you know, I talked with all sorts of investors. I talked with, you know, bankers all over the world. You know, even when we, you know, when we were working on, you know, stopping terrorism funding, rather than just working with governments and talking with the French or the German government or the Swiss government, I encouraged our people, and I went directly and talked with the, you know, CEOs of foreign banks about that topic. So I returned every call. I was accessible to people. You know, everybody's got their, I had plenty of weaknesses, but that, I needed to do that, okay? I needed to assimilate information, work on deals, otherwise you lose touch very quickly. And I gotta tell you, today, I've been out, I could no more go back and run a financial, it's been over 5 years since I've run a financial institution. I could no more do it today. It'd just be like an athlete who hasn't worked out for 5 years. You just have to, you have to work hard at it. One more. Okay.
Right behind. There you go.
Thank you very much. You've spoken a few times about the necessity of persuading others, being adept at the art of persuasion. I wondered if you could share some of your own, you know, what that takes and some of your own approach to that.
Well, everybody's got their own approach. And if any of you have heard me make a speech, you know it's a painful experience. So I certainly didn't persuade people standing up, giving a public speech and reading it. And so to me, what I found persuasion is first of all, and I learned this working with clients, it doesn't make any difference. You have to understand what they're thinking. You have to understand what their perspective is. You have to put yourself, if you're advising a CEO, in the CEO's shoes. So if I went in, one of the things I care about was, I care about environmental issues. Well, if I'm going in to see a senator from West Virginia, I sort of know where he starts with on coal mining, or if I'm going to Michigan and seeing someone from Michigan, I know where the Michigan delegation cares about some of the regulatory measures on fuel efficiency on automobiles or whatever. And so you have to, I think you need to start by understanding the other person's perspective and persuading. And I think it's futile to try to persuade people to do things that are not in their self-interest unless there's really a strong reason for doing it. Or you have to know how to appeal to them, but maybe it's not futile to try to persuade them if it's not in their self-interest, because I've done that. But you can't. You have to acknowledge, and you have to begin by acknowledging what the issues that they're dealing with. I think if you're dealing with a foreign country, which is a sovereign nation, you need to. You can't always say, "This is what I want. I want A, B, C, D, and E." Well, what are you prepared to give? So part of persuasion is finding a common ground, shared interest, and then it is listening. If you don't listen and understand what their arguments are and their point of view, and if you're just so busy trying to make your points, you're not going to persuade them. I also think it is based upon, a lot of it is trust. I had a, on the TARP vote, we had, the Senate Republicans voted, I think, 35-14 for us. We had the Senate Democrats, we had the House Democrats because they're in their leadership. The House Republicans were more difficult. But I had a senator tell me that when I met with the caucus, the most effective thing wasn't all the other arguments I made. At the end, when I said, listen, I didn't originally want this job. I came here to serve my country. I can never, I can make all the arguments in the world, and probably a lot of you will never understand what's going to happen to the financial system. You've just got to trust me and give us these authorities, or this is going to be a very sad day for our country. And he believed it based upon the way I'd said it and the fact that I'd had a history of working with him. So a lot of it is not just being able to stand up and make a speech. It helps if you're articulate. It helps if you can write, but there's a great advantage to being able to figure out how to look at the other man or woman, walk in the other woman's moccasins, understand what she's thinking, understand what he's thinking, and then try to persuade him. Too many people know just what they want. Or I used to tell investment bankers, you're there to serve the client. You're not there to sell a product. You've got to listen, you've got to understand their situation and say, how can I help them? And I think that's what a lot of sales is. And then if you want to persuade people to do something where there's going to be sacrifice up front, where it's going to be politically unpopular, don't treat them like idiots. Explain it is, and appeal to their higher sense.
Absolutely. Let me start by thanking President Levin for creating an environment that lets this kind of thing happen. You got to know how special this is. Let me thank Jim Levinson in the Jackson Institute for crafting this and helping us pull this together. And first and foremost, Secretary, let me thank you for an extraordinary set of insights for people who are soaking them in. My thanks.
Stan, thank you, and thank you all.